very important. And even though it clashed in some particular, even though it clashed in some ways with his own in terms of its basic underpinnings and its basic framework, nevertheless, he made a stunning remark that Freud is unparalleled as a psychotherapist. Now, I want to actually try to explain this and see it and explain in our own terms, that is, say, in terms of the tradition from Sinai, how this is so and how this can be understood. So, and it's very interesting also because we are able to explain this through the work of the Maharal of Prague, the Rabbi Löw of Prague, whom we've already cited as a conscious forerunner of Frankl himself. Frankl says that his logotherapy, or the model of human personality, which he calls dimensional ontology, has a forerunner in the Maharal of Prague, the great 16th and 17th century religious figure. Here too, by reference to the work of the Maharal of Prague, we can also show how the work of Freud could be dovetailed in some sense, how it can be integrated with the logotherapy of Viktor Frankl. Now, the way in which we understand this is by looking at a particular aspect of religious teaching, which has to do with what is called the divine attributes. Now, the Bible says that we are supposed to cleave to God's ways, and that is a way what that means. And for example, just as it's elaborated, for example, just as God is kind, we should be kind. Just as God is compassionate, we should be compassionate. Just as God is just, we should be just, and so on and so forth. But this is also explained in the mystical dimension of religious tradition as relating to the divine attributes. And when we say that the human being is made in the image of God, what that means is that the human being has the ability, the innate spiritual ability to resonate with and to model the divine attributes, obviously on a human scale. God's kindness can never be imitated wholly, if we say, by human kindness, even though it says that the divine attribute of kindness was out of work when Abraham was around, because he was such a paragon of kindness and so on. But we speak about the divine attributes. Now, these divine attributes, of which there are in fact 10 altogether, needs to be explained that these attributes are ways in which God relates to the creation. To say that these attributes inhere in God himself is not something which we can say. Because how can a human being possibly grasp the creator, the one who created human intellect, human existence, human understanding? God in himself is ultimately unfathomable. But what the tradition teaches us, what God has taught us through Torah, is that God created a set of attributes which are called wisdom, understanding, knowledge, kindness, judgment, severity, harmony, and so on and so forth. All of these attributes he created, so to speak, as the scale, if we just use a musical analogy, as a palette of emotional qualities of colors by which to run the world. The world which God created has in it something called kindness, something called judgment, something called harmony, mercy, and so on and so forth. These are the divine attributes which God decided, so to speak, which he created, through which to communicate to his creation, and that he runs the world, so to speak, through the application of these attributes. He could have created 100 attributes, 1,000, 1,000,000 attributes, but he created these attributes by which to relate. And we relate back to him because the human soul, which, if you like, is that mirror of the divine, it's called the divine likeness, also has these attributes within it. And we can relate to God because just as God has created this attribute of kindness, so in our spiritual makeup, there's an attribute of kindness, an attribute of judgment, an attribute of mercy, and so on and so forth. Now, what is the great significance in all of this to us in our discussion of Frankl and psychotherapy and of the Noahide laws, universal ethics, is that the seven. Let me just first say that the 10 attributes divide into what is known as 3 intellectual attributes, called in Hebrew chokhmah, bina, and das, wisdom, insight, and understanding. And then there are 7 so-called emotional attributes: kindness, severity, harmony, mercy, and so on and so forth. Now, what interests us here are these 7 so-called emotional attributes. Emotive, they have the qualities of feeling, like kindness, judgment, and so on and so forth. Now, what is of importance to us here is that these 7 emotional divine attributes correspond to the 7 Noahide laws. This is very important to understand this because the world today talks about kindness, it talks about compassion, it talks about judgment. But what it comes up with when it believes it's practicing compassion can be something pretty horrible. Compassion sometimes is used, for example, in the name of compassion, we have mass abortion, we have euthanasia. In the eyes of the Torah, this is not compassion at all, this is cruelty. So we need to know what true compassion is. We need to know what true kindness is. Any parent, when he or she is dealing with a child, is challenged by these issues. How shall I deal with my child? What is kindness? What is compassion? What is the appropriate kindness? What is the appropriate compassion? What is the appropriate judgment? And so on and so forth. But in general, we have in our dealings with the world, with God, with others, with people, these emotions come into play. But we're not speaking here about spontaneous emotions which just sort of well up in our hearts, in our minds, in our feelings, and so on and so forth, because these can be very treacherous emotions. The significance of the emotions, when we speak about them in a theological context, is that these emotions actually have a purified character. That the compassion, which is the compassion that God wants, is a compassion which is honed in accordance with the requirements of Noahide law. We have to know when our feelings are leading us astray or when our feelings are on course. And it's Torah which tells us what a honed compassion is, what a honed kindness is, what a honed faculty of judgment is. And in the simple terms, it is the Noahide laws which embody the purified expression of these attributes. And that is why it's brought down in the traditional, and I'll elaborate this in the course of today's words. That is why the 7 Noahide laws correspond to and give expression, practical expression to the 7 divine attributes, which we are going to be speaking here about today. And this is something which is a piece of knowledge, which perhaps has not been very accessible to the world. But the study of Frankl and Freud offers the prospect of a connection of this spiritual teaching to psychology itself. Now, what we find in Freud, and everybody has heard. We mentioned in the past that Freud spoke about basic instincts, and we mentioned 3 of these basic instincts in our talk of the last part in this series, previous part of this series. Freud spoke about Eros. Eros, or he called it, Eros is the name of a Greek deity, which he associated with libido, with the sexual drive of the human being. Then Freud spoke about another instinct, which he called an ego instinct, which is aggression. That is, how is that aggression played out? It can be played out quite simply against other people, other things, but it was also played out, says Freud, by the ego against the id. In other words, it was used there to repress the erotic impulses of the human being. So there is a but it can also express itself in plain and simple aggression towards others as well. Then there was a third instinct which Freud spoke about, and this was called Narcissism. He also gave the name of a Greek deity, Narcissus. No, he was actually, Narcissus was a human, but he was the son of a Greek god. So I don't know whether that makes him a god or a human or a mixture of both, whatever it was. So you had 3 of these figures in the 3 instinctual complexes, elements in this Freudian pantheon. Eros is a deity associated with love. Thanatos is a deity associated with death, aggression, and Narcissus is the son of a deity which is concerned with this concept of narcissism, or self-glorification, the sense of omnipotence, and so on and so forth. Now, sounds quite interesting that Freud has singled out these 3 characters, these 3. They were Greek mythical deities, or children of deities, and he is associating them with specific kinds of emotion. And there are these different emotions, if you like, or instincts, are situated in different parts of the psychological complex of the human being, according to Freud. Now, that's all very interesting, and it's very interesting from a spiritual standpoint, because these 3 characters, these 3 emotions, if you like, or instincts, drives, actually correspond to the negative forms of 3 primary divine attributes. So we speak about the divine attribute of loving kindness, for example. Freud speaks about Eros. What's the difference? The difference is that what loving kindness as a divine attribute is love, which is not egotistical. It's love which is directed towards others, to God, to other people. It's a love which is a sanctified love, and this concept of love in the Noahide laws translates into the law regulating sexual activity, which says that the fulfillment of the human being in this sexual dimension is in the marriage of a man and a woman, the sanctified marriage of a man and a woman, and that it has a highly spiritual intention. It is if you like, it is the channeling of a particular. It is the channeling of an emotion in such a way that the emotion becomes highly purified. It is normative, if you like, concept of a normative sexuality. Sexuality sanctified in the marriage of man and woman, whereby the man and the woman become an agent for the creation of further agents of God, human beings in this world. And it's an elevated thing. What is Eros? For Eros is the inverted form, or the self-directed form of that same attribute. In other words, this is the Freudian Eros is the wholly unspiritual expression of the same emotion, whereby the human being simply takes an object, a sexual object, and wants to make that into a means of personal gratification. It has got no altruistic or normative dimension to it whatsoever. And the spiritual tradition acknowledges that, yes, every human being, this attribute of, let us call it love, can be one which can be directed in either of two directions. It can either be something which is spiritual, which has a sanctified purpose and direction, or it can be utterly self-directed and wholly uninterested in any spiritual standard or regulation whatsoever. So that, for example, this attribute of Eros, what Frankl calls it Eros, we call it in Hebrew, it's called chesed, loving kindness. One is that they are the same attribute. One is negatively focused and one is positively focused. And the same thing happens when we come to the attribute of thanatos, which what Freud calls thanatos, or the aggressive instinct. In Freud, it is aggression. In the spiritual tradition, it is called the concept of judgment, dinim, as we say. And in the Noahide law, the aspect of this quality of, we call it severity or judgment. Its function is to evaluate and assess morality, and to make sure that one is living according to a moral standard. In other words, it's about the evaluation, just like the Noahide law of courts. What is its function? Its function is to make sure that the whole society is living by the other Noahide laws, to make sure that to make sure this is what justice is. Justice is to evaluate that the justice is not something which is predatory or arbitrary. Justice is supposed to be the balanced maintenance of a lifestyle or of a society in accordance with law. You know, we could call it, if you like, the concept of discipline or self-discipline in a very positive sense. A just person is a self-disciplined person, and that is the way in which a judge is supposed to function. A judge is supposed to rule out all partiality, all biases and prejudices, and just to assess the situation in accordance with the law, but to do so in a disinterested, which means a wholly unbiased way. So let us compare the Freudian thanatos with the same attribute as it's expressed in the spiritual tradition, which is that of givura or din or judgment. And you see that one is just a simple aggression, and the other is the idea of self-discipline. A world of difference. The same power of the same power of limiting and ordering and regimenting. It can be applied in a manner of aggression, to put down other people, to attack other people, to have aggression against other people, or it can be exactly the opposite. It can be one which is focused on self-discipline, self-limitation, limitation in accordance with an ideal. So here you see that there is the Freud has latched onto the negative manifestation of this of the attribute which in Torah, which in the Noahide tradition expresses itself as justice. Aggression is in its degenerate form, the same attribute is aggression. In its sanctified form, it is justice. And the third instinct, this instinctual element, which we highlighted in Freud, was that concept of narcissism. Now, this is a very interesting one because this is something which society is plagued with at the moment. Narcissism this relates to the divine attribute of harmony, beauty, balance. Now, in its proper form, this attribute of harmony is to recognize the beauty of the divine. In other words, it is the attribute which negates blasphemy. And in other words, it is that which accords glory and honor to God. Whereas in its degenerate form, it's that which accords glory and honor to oneself. That's narcissism. In other words, it's all a question of how the attribute is directed. Is it egotistically directed, in which case the person feels vainglory, the person is imperious about their own certainty of their rightness and so on and so forth? Or is it something, which says that the glory belongs to God, and that's the harmonious order we want to, and we want to guard ourselves against any mark of disrespect towards the Creator. In other words, it is the appreciation of the divine. So our society, in many ways, constantly speaks about compassion. And how does it express compassion? By a whole series of, unfortunately, very negative forms of legislation, which express paradoxically through huge amounts of killing, abortion on demand, euthanasia, assisted suicide, and through its concept of compassion by unraveling gender, creating incredible confusion amongst children and pain. And this is because they think that they are being compassionate. And their compassion understands the true balance and harmony which ought to exist in the world. But they're not interested in what God says is the harmony that exists in the world. It's their concept. And that's why, paradoxically, this kind of compassion expresses itself in extremely cruel and repressive action. We all hear now the expression of the cancel culture. The cancel culture is that when the people who are the so-called reformers, they will not allow another voice to be heard. Well, it sounds strange. They're so compassionate, and yet they are so repressive. But it's not really strange at all, because when the glory is ascribed not to God but to oneself, I know what has to be with the whole world. I will decide what's compassionate and what's good. And if anybody tries to argue with me, they say, I will silence them. That is vainglory. That is narcissism. So we see all. So what Freud was speaking, Freud actually embraced all of the negative aspects of the attributes in the person. He was quite happy for people to go on a rampage of erotic self-gratification, leading to all sorts of strange behaviors. He said society is holding back healthy aggression, and he also somehow seems to extol some kind of narcissism. Whereas the Noahide laws take each of these attributes and say, no, these attributes are these are negative expressions of the attributes. These are animal expressions of the attributes. We want human expressions of these attributes, sanctified expressions of these attributes. So what I'm saying then is that in fact, Freud's selection of these instincts is extremely significant because he's hit the nail on the head. He's hit, and this is maybe why Frankl said about Freud that there's nobody like him, because he has this extraordinary perception of the instinctual palette of the human personality. The only problem is that Freud has picked these key attributes in the human being in their negative expressions, not in their sanctified positions. And that's why when he extols the forms of behavior associated with each of these instincts, in fact, he's extolling behaviors which are the opposite of the Noahide laws, because the Noahide laws require the sanctified form of these attributes, not Eros and endless self-gratification, polymorphous perversity. That Eros is the marriage of man and woman. That's what Eros, that's the true sanctified Eros. The true, when it comes to Thanatos, is not mere aggression. To the contrary, it's about discipline, order, justice. And Narcissism is not about vainglory and megalomania and imperiousness. It's about the glory of God and the order which God has placed in the creation, the order, the balance and the harmony which God has prescribed for creation. So, at all events, this gives us a very important handle on the work of Freud. In other words, and how Freud can be drawn in to how Freud's work can be drawn into a framework which allows both a reinterpreted Freud together with Frankl's emphasis on the structure of the human being as being led by the human soul, human conscience. In other words, we have to understand that the human being is a complex of emotions or attributes that makes up human personality from the Freudian perspective, and it is one correct perspective. What is wrong with Freud, so to speak, is that Freud has taken the negative form of these attributes and made them normative. And the real task is to modify and to transform and sanctify these attributes, to give them the form which they should have as divine attributes, not animal, not base attributes, but divine attributes. In other words, reconfigured, reoriented, and transformed so that they express a set of emotions, a set of feelings, which are in fact sanctified feelings, and form the interior of the lawful existence of a human being according to the 7 Noahide laws. The 7 attributes need to be consistent and coherent with the 7 Noahide laws. So this is an uncanny way, and as a matter of fact, and it's once again the Maharal of Prague, this absolutely seminal figure who teaches us also how to connect the individual Noahide laws with the 7 attributes. And this is done in the work. The book itself explains this at some length, and it's also been dealt with in my book, The Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics. But basically, it shows, I won't go into it all now, but it does show how the Maharal of Prague derives these correspondences between the different attributes and the Noahide laws. In other words, the emotions which are coherent, sanctified, elevated conduct in the human being. Now, you may ask, well, all right, that's we see that in other words, Freud is to be drawn in, so to speak, as having got the picture right, but in an inverse manner. Where do we see in Freud himself that his own work, so to speak, cottoned on to this idea of the transformation of the instincts? of the purification of the instincts. And this actually, we do find a most tantalizing indication that Freud intuited this himself. And this comes about as a result of came about in the course of an extraordinary meeting, which I document in the book also, of a meeting between Freud and a great rabbinic figure in the European winter of 1902, 1903. It was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe who went to see Freud, and he. It's very interesting. I don't know. There's a patient and a doctor. I don't know who the patient and the doctor is. It looks like Freud is the doctor and the Rebbe is the patient, but I think it was the other way around, frankly. But at all events, this great rabbi comes to Freud, and he has some evidence of some depression. Now that's unusual for a great rabbinic figure, because depression is not a very elevated emotion. From a theological point of view, we avoid depression to the utmost degree. How could a Rebbe be experiencing a certain depression? Well, when we look at the documents, we see it wasn't an ordinary depression. What this rabbi said to Freud was that he felt that his intellect was not clear, and he felt that his emotions were also not purified. Now, this was a very strange thing for this rabbi to say, because in fact he was a giant in both departments. He was a tremendous scholar, and he was a person of huge refinement. And Freud knew this, and Freud could see this. And Freud produced this extraordinary analysis, a diagnosis, which says that I see in this man that what the mind grasps, the heart cannot contain, and what the heart demands, the mind cannot come to. Now that's an extraordinary statement. That's not a diagnosis of common or garden depression. But what it really was saying was that he saw that in this religious figure, he saw that the emotions had been so refined that they couldn't be satisfied by the intellect. In other words, sometimes we have an emotional yearning for truth, which the mind doesn't necessarily match up to. And it can be the other way too. The mind can have a depth of understanding and be disappointed by the heart's inability to produce the corresponding emotion. Well, really what this shows in a person of this stature is not that this person is a failure, God forbid, the very opposite, to the contrary, but that the emotions are so refined that it's not satisfied by understanding. And the understanding is so refined that it's not satisfied by the emotions, which don't seem to correspond to that level of understanding. And Freud says, you know what? This is a characteristic of a very special person. People whose intellect and emotions are separately and independently so developed that there sometimes becomes a certain kind of tension between the two. Anyway, it's what I've said. It's pretty abstract, but you'll find a more of an explanation of it in the book. But what Freud was actually saying was this was not Freud talking about the release of the libido or aggression or anything like that. To the contrary, Freud beholds before him and says it. Here's a person who has totally refined their qualities, their attributes. And so Freud himself seems to be saying, you know what? Saying something totally it's totally inconsistent, so to speak, or out of character. It's totally out of character with the rest of his work. Is I see before me a person whose attributes have been totally refined and totally transformed. How does that go together with the Freud that we heard about, lamenting the repression of ego, of aggression and libido and so on and so on? It doesn't seem to work. But it is an amazing moment in which, so to speak, Freud himself is transformed in the presence of this great spiritual figure and says, I behold, essentially, totally transformed attributes. So Freud himself in this encounter is himself acknowledging the concept that the attributes themselves can be transformed. In other words, the human being personality is a complex of attributes. Let's call it Eros, Thanatos, Narcissism, or in their holy form, let's call it loving kindness, discipline, and beauty, harmony. And Freud himself seems to be saying in this moment, I recognize the transformation of these attributes. And so this actually is then the way in which we can actually draw in and connect Freud with the spiritual tradition in which Frankl situated himself. And then in the final part of this chapter, which I won't go into right now, I discuss various ways in which different psychotherapies can be worked in tandem with logotherapy. In other words, with the spiritual dimension. How do we have to deal? Of course, you see that, and this is a point that Frankl acknowledged frontally and openly from the outset. He says, look, I'm talking about an ideal of the human being, about meaning. But at the same time, I recognize that there are very murky and turgid areas in human personality, and we need to draw on other kinds of therapies to work with this. But psychotherapy, which deals with the lower dimension of the human being, has to be applied in tandem with logotherapy, which works with the higher faculties of the human being. And only by the coordination of a psychotherapy with a logotherapy, with a therapy which recognizes the human spirit, are we going to do justice to the human being. Because the human being is essentially a spiritual being. He or she also has a psychological and somatic dimension, psychophysical dimension. But these are to be ultimately linked through therapy or through personal work, which we do with ourselves, the healthy person, to that higher faculty. And it's the coordination of psychotherapy and logotherapy, which is the ideal. And says Frankl, I find amongst all of the psychotherapies, psychoanalysis, the psychoanalysis of Freud, amongst the most perceptive of all. But we must wrest from psychoanalysis the notion that the human being is simply the psychophysical dimension, simply the subrational, the subrational being, the being without a spiritual interest or concern. That we have to deny to Freud. But once we deny that to Freud, once we force, so to speak, Freud to acknowledge that there is a spiritual, the true I is the spiritual I, then we can use Freud himself. And this meeting which Freud had with the Rabbi seemed to extract precisely that acknowledgement from Freud, even though it vanished thereafter. All right, well, we'll stop at that point.